Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This for the week of February 15th to 21st, 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host, John DeVille. Before getting started, we would like to send a special shout out to our good friends at Go Taikonauts and Spacewatch.global, two excellent sources for space industry news. This week, we bring you updates on Chinese auto giant Geely acquiring a license to manufacture satellites at their Taizhou superfactory, a report on all of the difficulties between China and the United States, in the space domain. But first, Jean will bring us an update on why Chinese and Russian relations in the space sector are following Dogecoin all the way to the moon. But first, we'll roll the intro.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
John, take it away with China-Russia relations and what's going on there.
Absolutely. This week we heard from Space News and from Space News' Chinese space journalist Andrew Jones that China and Russia very likely would soon be signing a memorandum of understanding regarding their lunar exploration plans, and more specifically the ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station. And this is based, I believe, on Russian governmental releases. And we don't really have anything tangible on this MOU or what this would imply, but I think this is a great opportunity to just discuss a little bit the ILRS and what this all means. So the ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station in Chinese, it's 国际月球科研站, basically means the same thing. This was a concept that was revealed by China in 2016, I believe. And basically, it's very close to, the concept of Moon Village, I'd say, that was unveiled by ESA back in 2015, which is, so Moon Village, the idea of reproducing the success of the ISS, but having it this time on the lunar surface. And the ILRS, perhaps, and notably CNSA, gives maybe a little bit more detail on what they mean by this concept through their presentations. They give a phased approach to how this would take place. And so typically there are 3 phases. There would be a phase 1 taking place between 2021 and 2030. This is the objective of this phase is to build initial infrastructure for the ILRS. And this would be based on a lot of lessons learned from the upcoming Chang'e 6, 7, and 8 missions, which would take place starting from probably 2023 and would focus on notably critical technologies for a potential future research base, and such as in situ resource utilization, 3D printing with lunar regolith, harvesting energy, exploiting the water in the southern pole, this sort of thing. And so there'd be, Chang'e 6, 7, 8, but potentially also the ILRS could benefit from space partners of China. So that could be the Russian lunar missions. It could also be the ESA lunar missions that are to take place in this decade. And then we'd have the phase 2, which would be between 2031 and 2035. And this would be, so I'm quoting them here, an expanded ILRS to sustain long-term automated missions or short-term crewed missions. And we know that today, China is already starting to build the infrastructure, the means to reach this goal with the super heavy rocket Long March 9. They also tested last year for the first time the next generation crewed vehicle. And then we have the final phase, which is phase 3 between 2036 and 2045. And this would be, again, I'm quoting here, a full-fledged lunar base enabling long-term stays on the moon, enabling large-scale scientific missions, and also exploiting lunar resources. And so I think the ILRS is a major shift, a change for China in the sense that so far it's done a lot of its its space exploration and crewed space missions by itself, admittedly sometimes not willingly, and that this is something that we've seen changing over the past years. We've seen more and more foreign payloads embark upon Chang'e 4 and the upcoming Chang'e 6. And the ILRS would definitely be just one step further in international cooperation. And we know that for the ILRS, Russia is very interested, as mentioned by Space News. We know that ESA is also in close contact with China on this concept. Maybe the only very very striking absence here, but unsurprising, is the US, because as we know, NASA is not allowed to be in direct contact or to work with the Chinese. And there's also the fact that the US is also pushing forward on their side their own concepts, the Artemis Accords, which would be codifying and defining basically the code of conduct in space exploration. Obviously, there's the Artemis program. And so what we're seeing here materializing is sort of two directions. One is China-led, one is US-led. And I think it'll be interesting to see how these move forward. And I think it's a bit worrying to see that, we have two blocks going in two different directions. And maybe only Europe has a foot in both blocks right here. European countries are involved in the Artemis program, but ESA is also interested in ILRS. So I think the fact that we have two separate projects, this is probably material for future bickering in space and potential conflict. So anyway, I don't know if the political tension between the US and China could diffuse at some point and also then bring together these programs. I think space exploration, as the ISS has shown between the US and Russia, and it's really one of the areas where we are still able to cooperate and keep a little bit politics out of this. But because there are no direct commercial interests just yet. But yeah, I think anyway, that's the ILRS, and it's a very interesting and new development in lunar exploration.
Yeah, quite a lot to unpack here. So I think a couple of points worth mentioning. So I don't know if this extends to government type of relations, but I would first point out that in China, and also I think in the United States to some extent, the signing of an MOU, it's an event, it's a significant, nice event between people or between organizations, but it's a very early stage thing. So companies will sign MOUs to say that we are looking to cooperate in something, and basically the MOU just serves as literally the memorandum of understanding. So like these two companies understand that we're both going to look into cooperating. So it is certainly, it's a step, it's an important step. It's a good thing for China-Russia space relations, but it is still relatively early phases. And also, again, they have not yet signed the MOU. So they are allegedly getting close to signing the MOU, which would itself probably be basically saying that China and Russia have some plans to work together to do this. So again, not to say that this is, it's an important update, but it's not, say, a contract, let's say. So, but I guess then looking more specifically at China and Chinese and Russian collaboration in the space sector, it certainly makes a lot of sense for a number of reasons, I think. So, Jean, when you were talking just now about sort of the phased approach by China to this lunar development program, I was, and you were mentioning these dates of 2036 to 2045. It sounds extremely kind of Chinese government in the sense that it is literally a plan 25 years from now, basically, is 2045, 24 years. And in Russia, I think this is something that has consistently been a challenge in their space industry. Now, granted, I'm not an expert on Russia, and so I don't, do not take me at my word on this. But my understanding is that over the last several decades, Russia's space industry and the economy more generally have been quite linked to the price of oil. And as a result, when oil prices are very high, the government budgets are quite strong and you have lots of good things happening. But then when oil prices go down, you have government budgets go down very quickly with them. And that makes it very hard to have very long-term plans, because if those long-term plans are kind of based on the oil price, they only have so much control over that. And so this idea then that partnering with this country that has a much more diversified economy in China, where they can have a bit more of a long-term planning process, that presumably allows Russia to have some degree of, increased certainty with what types of capabilities they're going to have access to in space. And from the Chinese side, certainly you could imagine areas of technological interest where Russia would be just more advanced than China. The Russian space program is quite some decades older than the Chinese space program, and certainly there are some areas where Russia is still leading or at least one of the top couple of countries in the world. And so I think in general you're likely to see increased cooperation between these two countries. The other point that I would mention as it relates to China-Russia is that at more of a kind of smaller scale, maybe commercial or even just company-to-company level, in Russia you've had, I think, this increased desire to do things domestically, as we've had in other countries as well. And that's, I think, more important in Russia because the extent to which their currency is linked to oil prices. And so, again, buying things from outside with a rather unstable currency, especially when you're buying big, important or big, expensive space things that might take a long time to pay back, a Russian company doesn't want to have $200 million of debt on their balance sheet for 20 years because the price of those $200 million in ruble terms could double or triple or be cut in half during that time. So again, digressing, the Russian government and the Russian space sector, they are trying to become more domestically capable, let's say, and self-sufficient. But at the same time, there is this desire to diversify away from the traditional international sources for space industry technology, that being the US and Europe. And I think when Russia does business with China, there's probably a little bit more flexibility by China as compared to Europe or certainly the US in terms of being willing to be flexible on payment terms, possibly taking payment in things like natural resources. So I think that there's probably a fair amount of sort of alignment of interests between China and Russia in the space sector. And I think that as a result, you're going to see probably more of these high-level cooperations, but also potentially more, again, company to company or other kind of not quite as government-level cooperation. So, again, it's an interesting story, and I would point out that it's an MOU, but it's signs of just generally warming relations. So. Anything else, John, from your side on the China-Russia situation, or shall we head into the China-U.S.?
And I would also add that we have frequent comments also from the Russian space industry on how the Artemis Accords and the way U.S. does space exploration, how it's very U.S.-centric. And definitely I think it is a sign of how the close cooperation that we had between Russia and the U.S. for the ISS, will not be entirely reproducible for the the next level space exploration. Russia seems to be more China leaning, definitely.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I wonder to what extent that was caused in part by I guess SpaceX kind of killing the business for the Proton was the Russian rocket that was launching U.S. astronauts and a lot of U.S. satellites for quite some time. I think it was
there was a Soyuz capsule.
Yeah, Soyuz, yes, so I guess that was a pretty good business for Russia for quite some time, and I think now it's not such a big business. So there's less reason, I guess, to attach themselves to the U.S. Space sector, as it were. That's interesting. So I guess on that note, so the U.S. space sector, we saw this week a report released by the Secure World Foundation and by the Kalis Foundation. The report was titled Lost Without Translation, and it was a deep dive into U.S. perceptions of the Chinese commercial space sector and basically just a close examination of this relationship between the U.S. and China in space, such that it is. So pretty lengthy report. I recommend having a look. There's a lot of interesting takeaways, but just at a high level, a few of the main points that really stuck out to me when I had a read through it. So again, this is looking at U.S. perceptions of Chinese commercial space. So the first main takeaway is this information asymmetry that exists between the U.S. and China. And essentially what that means is that Chinese space companies and the Chinese government has a lot more information about their U.S. counterparts than the U.S. does about their Chinese counterparts. And it comes about due to a lot of different factors. So there's, I think, a language factor involved in the sense that a lot more people in China can capably read English language sources than can Americans read Chinese language sources. So I think that would certainly be one factor. I think there's also a certain degree of increased there's a larger, I think, proliferation of Western media and just sort of Western stuff in general in China than there is Chinese stuff in the U.S. Now, granted that, you'd have people say, well, that's Google is banned in China and Facebook is banned in China, and that's all correct. But there's still, I mean, it's rather striking to look at the U.S. and see how relatively little Chinese influence there is in terms of like the actual perception of people in daily life. And when you look at China, there's a fair amount of sort of American and Western influence there. And then I think that, so in this report, there's this point about this information asymmetry and that, the U.S. just does not have a very good understanding of what is going on in China. They don't have a lot of information about what's going on in China. The second big takeaway, I think, from the report is that despite this information asymmetry, there's still a desire by U.S. space companies U.S. space companies to engage with Chinese counterparts commercially, so to sell things into China or to otherwise potentially buy things from China, I guess, but sort of under specific, well-defined terms. So that would obviously include things like Western intellectual property protection standards or things like having the settlement of commercial conflicts being done in neutral areas. So, for example, it might be very hard for a U.S. company to try to sell something into China if one of the conditions of that sale was that any kind of commercial dispute would be done in a Chinese court. That would be, I think, so. So you have this desire by U.S. companies and other actors to engage with China, but again, under these rather specific terms that are not always in place in China, I would say. And then I guess the last point that I would mention about this report that was, I think, of interest was, the last highlight of the report probably was, nearly half of respondents, when asked the question, are there Chinese commercial space companies, nearly half were unsure, and about 1/4 said yes, and about 1/4 said no. And I think that's, first of all, it's indicative of the level of kind of the lack of clarity around what is commercial in China in terms of the space industry. But I think it's also an indication of, the lack of, understanding by the U.S. of the Chinese space industry, potentially. I guess it's also maybe it could be an indication that the best answer to that question is sort of a not sure or like a, neither yes nor no. Because if you ask me, is there a commercial space sector in China? I would say, more often than not, I would probably say yes, although it's incorrect to say there's a purely commercial space sector in China, just as it would be incorrect to say that in the U.S. I think an interesting report overall. It definitely, the Secure World Foundation and Kalis, they tend to do a very good job of presenting things in a pretty balanced way. And I mean, there's a certain U.S. perspective here, obviously, but they did talk to some Chinese stakeholders as well, and I know people from Secure World and also from Kalis who have been over to China to speak with Chinese counterparts and try to understand things from both sides. So overall, I think a worthwhile report to read through. A lot of interesting conclusions about how the U.S. and China can improve their prospects for cooperation in space and just sort of some different ideas about these two countries. So recommended read. Jean, anything from your side on the Lost Without Translation, which I do like the name. It's one of my favorite films, is Lost in Translation. So have to give a shout out to that. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a good reference. I think that I haven't read the report extensively, but I would definitely agree with some of the takeaways you've given here. Definitely, the information asymmetry is clear. When a Chinese company wants to look up a U.S. space company, they just type their website, and you have a lot of information already out there on the internet. The other way around, not so straightforward, because a lot of Chinese space companies don't have websites, and when they do, they're not necessarily up to date. Just websites is not as much as the norm as it would be in say in the US. And so I think that's the first thing. Probably if you want information, you'd have better luck digging into maybe the Chinese media or Weibo or WeChat or just Chinese platforms. That's the first thing. And another thing is also the practice of transparency regarding just employees and their backgrounds and who's working for who. For example, in the US with LinkedIn, you can just get a lot of information on who are you talking to, what were their previous jobs, and what company they're working for. LinkedIn exists, and it's it can operate in China, but it hasn't been working that well, not that much success, and so it's very hard to find specific employees by doing there's no search engine for that. You can try LinkedIn in China, but usually you don't have that many Chinese employees that are of a given company that are on LinkedIn, except those that are maybe doing international trade. So yeah, those would be probably my thoughts. And another thought also on this report, not this report, but more generally on reports on China. This is actually the third report on Chinese space in 6 weeks. And so that's definitely a lot, and maybe starting to close a little bit this information asymmetry, although it's still a huge gap. So we had Lost Without Translation just a couple of days ago. We also had the SP report, New Space in Asia, which has maybe 30% of it that's dedicated specifically to China, and it's also something that Blaine and I contributed to. So yeah, that's the second report. They're less on the perceptions of China and more really on facts, trends, and discussing policy. And we have a third report that's by IFRI, which is the French Institute for International Relationships. It's called China's Ambition in Space, The Sky's the Limit, by Marc Julien, who's the head of China research there. And yet another very, very interesting report published early in January, and that focuses, at least one of the main takeaways here, I think, is also it's a very, very good report from the policy and the space ecosystem, how the space ecosystem is organized. So 3 reports in 6 weeks definitely shows increasing interest in the very dynamic Chinese space industry. So a dynamic industry it is indeed. I think Blaine, you also had an interesting update about space ventures of a company called Geely.
Oh yeah, we have another week and another Chinese decabillionaire having a major announcement about one of his space ventures, and what an announcement indeed. So last week, Thursday the 18th, Geely, Geely is one of China's largest auto manufacturers. They announced that they had been granted a license to begin manufacturing satellites at their super factory in Taizhou, Zhejiang province. So just to review again, Geely is one of China's leading automakers. It's arguably the leading private automaker in China, because a lot of the automakers would be partly state-owned. They also own a number of different overseas automakers. So they own Lotus. They own a large stake in Proton, which is the Malaysian car manufacturer. They own Volvo, and they also own about 8% of Daimler. So it's a pretty big automotive conglomerate. And Geely's CEO, Li Shufu, he's one of several figures that you could kind of say resembles a Chinese version of Elon Musk. So he's worth about 25 billion US dollars, which is roughly doubled over the last year due to Geely's share price increasing. And he's been quite vocal about his vision to transform Geely from this purely an auto manufacturer to kind of an autonomous mobility services provider. And part of this transformation would be through this sort of enhanced satellite navigation and also sort of vehicle-to-vehicle communications constellation concept. And so a year ago, we saw Geely announce plans to build this constellation, and they announced an investment of about $325 million into this satellite factory in Taizhou in Zhejiang province. And again, just this past week, we've now seen them. They have been given the license to start manufacturing satellites at this factory. And the article also mentioned that Geely would be launching the first satellite in its constellation in the first half of 2021. So like any month now, we could say. Certainly, it's a very interesting development. I think that there's certainly this implicit assumption that China will launch at least one large low Earth orbit constellation of satellites, probably something that will try to rival to some extent Starlink or Kuiper in that it would offer broadband communications across most of the world. You could imagine this being useful not only for Chinese companies in other countries, but also for the Chinese government, potentially for the Chinese military. This is particularly true as China is getting to be increasingly international with all of its activities. So I think the implicit assumption is that China will launch at least one of these constellations, but that the the major constellation that gets launched by China will be a state-owned kind of CASC and or China Telecom type of operated constellation, and that commercial companies will have a very hard time launching their own constellation because it's a big piece of infrastructure. And the interesting thing about Geely and about their business plan is that they have talked about having this be a very specifically purposed constellation of connecting a bunch of cars and having enhanced navigation to these cars, and having this be kind of an autonomous vehicle-focused constellation. And that may or may not be financially sensible. It may or may not be possible. Like, taking all of that aside, just this idea that Geely has a very specific and basically a vertically integrated plan in mind for this constellation, I think that would make it rather more acceptable to the Chinese leadership than if it were just a company saying we want to build a broadband constellation without as clear of a way of utilizing it. It will still probably be an uphill battle, I would imagine, if Geely wants to operate a global constellation of communication satellites. However, again, their CEO is a deca-billionaire, and they have a pretty big market. They manufacture a lot of cars already, and they could conceivably say we're going to use this constellation to connect a bunch of cars. So yeah, I mean, if not them, then who would be my question. But certainly it's a big announcement, I think, from Geely that you have this license granted by the NDRC to start manufacturing satellites, and again, just the company reaffirming that they plan to launch their first satellite in the first half of 2021. So certainly we'll be on the lookout for that. Jean, any thoughts from your side on Geely and on this update?
Yeah, in the press release that discusses this license, they also discuss an interesting figure, which is the number of satellites that the factory would produce, 500 per year. That's a huge number when you compare it to the other gigafactory projects that you have in China. ComSat, for example, I think they're aiming at 100 satellites per year. We have Galaxy Space, they're aiming at anything between 300 and 500. So for Geely, 500 satellites a year. If this satellite manufacturing capability is only dedicated to their constellation, which would be operated by a company called Qingdao Shanghe Aerospace Technology. We discussed this in episode 18 of the Dongfang Hour. That would be a very big constellation indeed, several thousands of satellites. Or the other possibility would be that this factory could also be serving the needs of other Chinese constellations that would also, need satellite manufacturing. So that's the first point. And the second point also that this makes me think of is I think Geely is really takes the role very well of what we could call the new space small sat manufacturer, in the sense that they come from the automobile industry. And we all know that the automobile industry is a very mass market, very large scale, big volumes industry, and where production costs and the optimization of production, of manufacturing, and bring down costs is extremely important. And I think this fits really well with the whole idea of new space and just Geely's space ventures, because the idea here, even though this huge factory won't be building as many cars, as many satellites as it's building cars, it's the same idea of just increasing a lot the volume output and bring costs down. And this experience from the automobile industry would definitely serve Geely quite well, especially when you consider that, as mentioned earlier, we have other more and more gigafactory projects, satellite gigafactory projects that are sprouting here and there in China. So I think that they fit that role very well.
For sure. I think definitely what we're going to see is, as you mentioned, a lot of the synergies between Geely's manufacturing capabilities in automotive potentially being applied to manufacturing satellites. I guess one last point that I would mention as it relates to Geely, and this is something that we've heard, from different people in the industry over the last couple of years, is that they have hired a handful of the sort of original team at Space OK, which is a small satellite manufacturer in Shanghai, so near to Taizhou, and that team has kind of formed some of the core of Ge Space in terms of the core space industry know-how, if you will. So certainly, I think something to keep an eye on for sure, and we will have to check back by the end of the first half of 2021 to see if they have indeed met that goal of launching their first satellites by then. Yeah, so I think that's about it for this week. Anything else from your side, Jean? Are we all good?
All good.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining. This has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 15th to 21st of February. We will be, I will be joining you next week from quarantine in Hong Kong. I may decide to do some live streams or something like that on YouTube during those 21 days, just to see if anybody would like to come and talk about the Chinese space industry with me while I'm in solitary confinement. So be on the lookout for that. And in the meantime, thank you for joining, and have a good rest of your week.
Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.